Good evening. I'm happy to see so many people come out tonight, brave this cold weather. You are true Vermonters. I'm Jane Vossler, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Community Senior Center and the Richmond Historical Society, and we had a little help from the Richmond Library also. It's really a pleasure to have Will Gusakov with us tonight. For the last 20 years, he's been restoring, designing, and building timber frame structures. And his work has brought him across Vermont, the US, and around the world to places like Ghana and Poland and Estonia and Italy and France. He's a member of the Charpentier. Yes, Charpentier Sans Frontières, yes. Or Carpenters Without Borders. And he runs Goosewing Timberworks, a small custom timber framing business from his home in Lincoln. So let's give a big round of welcome to Will.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming out, and thanks for that introduction and the invitation to speak here. As some of you might have gathered, I had the great good fortune and luck in 2023 to travel to France and spend 6 months helping to participate in the recreation of specifically the nave roof timber frame of the Notre Cathedral in Paris. I was not the only Vermont timber frame carpenter to go. 4 or 5 Vermonters went over, including a friend who's local to Huntington, grew up and still is working in Huntington, Miles Janessa, Vermont Heavy Timber, and other friends and colleagues. And I will, in this talk and slideshow, just be sharing a little tiny survey of context about the cathedral itself, but really mostly about the experience I had and the process of rebuilding the timber frame for the nave roof of the cathedral. And a side note, there is a table with some materials that you're welcome to come after the presentation for a little bit to check out. There's an axe and a plumbod and some plans, construction drawings, etc. Just a little bit of material that was involved in this project. I'm curious, are there any folks here who speak French? Any folks that had visited the Notre Cathedral? Anybody in carpentry or engineering fields? All right, all 3, that's great. It's just nice for me to know. So the Cathedral of Paris, there can only be 1 cathedral in any city in France. There can't be 2. So this is the only Cathedral of Paris. It was built over roughly 100 years in the 12th and 13th centuries, between 1160 and 1260, give or take. Even during that 100 years, there was a non-linear progression of its building. And it underwent restoration campaigns several different times over the last 900 years. The last very major restoration campaign was over the last 5 years. Before that, the major restoration campaign happened in the middle of the 19th century for about 10 years, around 1850, when a still famous architect named Eugène Viollet-le-Duc kind of restored and actually did some tweaks and redesigns to many parts of the building. Nonetheless, mostly original to the medieval period are much of the stonework. So these are the 2 bell towers. This is the front entry facade. Much of the stonework of not all, but much of the stonework of the transepts. This is the nave, choir, and the rounded end of the choir is the apse in English. And carpentry-wise, which really wood framing is just existing from the top of the walls up, the nave and choir and apse existed from their original construction until the fire of 2019, whereas the transept and the spire were completely redesigned and reframed in the Viollet-le-Duc restoration in the mid-19th century. So as folks probably remember and have seen in the news, both in the last few months as the cathedral's reopened and in the last several years, the cathedral caught fire in April of 2019. Go ahead. And if you hit the space bar, it's a video. Maybe without me being there, there's no audio, but Yeah, the spire puncturing down through all these beautiful 900-year-old oak roof trusses that you can see there silhouetted as they're beginning to immolate and puncturing the stone vaults of the roof below. Quick comment that smoke is thick and yellow. Anybody know why? It's lead. Yeah, there was hundreds of metric tons of lead covering the roof. It's replaced with lead, yes. Yep, and basically to the same spec as what had been there. And what had been there was not original to 1200. The lead roofing had been replaced, but yes, so that is vaporizing lead, hundreds of tons of vaporizing lead that rained down on the greater Paris area and created lasting problems environmentally there. Go ahead. Some photos of the aftermath of the fire. Most of these are public domain photos that you've probably maybe have seen in news reports, et cetera. There was a huge amount of scaffolding that was up at the time of the fire. And this is all twisted, melted, and collapsed scaffolding. But for the most part, the scaffolding that was threatening to completely destroy the cathedral after the fire managed not to collapse and was disassembled. It's not the subject of this talk, but there's lots of great documentaries that have come out in the last year or two about this restoration, and I recommend you check them out. So here's these tons upon tons of galvanized steel pipe scaffolding that thankfully did not collapse post-fire, and otherwise it would have largely destroyed a lot of the stonework. What the fire destroyed was mostly, generally speaking, from the roof up. There was a lot of smoke damage, water damage, and some structural damage to the stonework. Vaulting, we saw the spire fall. It punctured a large hole in the vaulting here, and the transepts, you can see the vaulting, gaping hole in the vault there. There was other structural damage, but generally speaking, it was mostly the roofing, the spire, and the roof framing systems that were absolutely completely destroyed. The stone vaults generally managed to hold the weight of the collapsing burning timbers on top of them without collapsing themselves, those vaults are actually in some places only 3 or 4 inches thick. The structural ribs of the vaults are thicker, but there's a lot of infilled vault stone. So it's quite wonderful, maybe miraculous, that there wasn't greater damage sustained by the structure. Go ahead. To give a little context to the decision-making around how the cathedral would be rebuilt, I don't know if anybody followed this closely at the time, but in the week or two following the fire, obviously a great deal of attention nationally and internationally. The French president, Emmanuel Macron, first of all gave a promise as kind of a French moonshot that within 5 years the cathedral would be restored and reopened to the public, which there was massive skepticism about, including in me, thinking that such a huge project could be actually pulled off in France of all places, which is not the fastest with bureaucracy usually. Macron and others in the media and in the building and architectural environment, some of them talked about completely redesigning the cathedral roof in general, or particularly the spire, maybe make it 21st century, modern, a needle of steel and glass, etc., like had been done in the late 20th century at the Louvre Museum. There's a famous glass pyramid coming up through the courtyard. There was other folks in the public discourse who were proposing to rebuild the structure of the roof in potentially steel or glulam timber, to redesign the structural design, even though those trusses had lasted for 850 years, etc. So there was also a lot of stories in newspapers, pundits on TV, etc., doubting whether France had the oak timbers available to rebuild as it was, or carpenters that had the skills needed to rebuild the cathedral as it had been, or whether the documentation of the existing frame was there, that the frame could be rebuilt as it had been. Preservationists, purists, folks who are involved with the cathedral, including the chief architect, were right from the start very much insistent that it be rebuilt the way it had been built originally. So there was a public debate going on around this. The funding was never in question because the French government received about $1 billion in donations in the weeks really following the fire. And you can be the judge of whether that was the French government and the Catholic Church are really in need of donations, crowdsourced donations. Nonetheless, they had $1 billion, and in fact, after the entire restoration, that's proved to be more than enough to do the whole thing, and there's money left over that's an endowment for the cathedral. So the funding was not in question. Go ahead. In terms of documentation, so I mentioned that the spire and transept areas, the transept would be the small gable crossing of the main body of the cathedral, had been rebuilt in around 1850, and the original drawings and construction shop drawings, et cetera, from that restoration are still existing in museum collections. So the Viollet-le-Duc was a classical architect with incredible skills, and this is the spire he designed on his own. There was no spire prior to his restoration. It was his idea of what either had been built in 1200 or really what should have been built. He was very audacious. So this is a flamboyant neo-Gothic style of spire. Anyways, that's a different subject. An incredible, incredible piece of carpentry. So there's documentation of the transept and spire frame. Go ahead. And by chance, a few years before the fire, a couple of kind of all-star architecture grad students had done a systematic, over a year and a half, had done a systematic documentation of the medieval parts of the frame, the apse, the choir, and the nave. And this is just one drawing of one truss, but they made hundreds and hundreds of drawings of the different dimensions, plans, longitudinal cross-sections, including notes on every little idiosyncrasy everywhere, because many of these pieces were different in each truss, and there's hundreds of pieces, etc. So lots of notes. This is an example of one of these sketches that was done as part of this guy, Rémy Froment, his thesis project as an architecture grad student. Fast forward 4 years, and the cathedral burned, and he was actually already had become a chief historic architect in the French government, and was one of the 3 chief historic architects in charge of the restoration, and he was in charge of the carpentry. And we worked with him quite a lot. He's a wonderful, extremely knowledgeable carpenter. And him and his co-worker that's this guy, Cédric Ponceau, were the 2 guys that did these sketches and that so intimately knew the carpentry. They had spent 2 years of their life crawling around the attic, taking photos and drawing everything. And it was quite amazing to have them interacting with our work and them saying, yes, this is exactly as it was. So it happened that the documentation for rebuilding the medieval parts of the carpentry also existed. There were also 3D point cloud scans that had been done by some researchers in the early 2000s, and a fair amount of photographic archival evidence as well. But thankfully, there was actually no systematic architectural documentation of this frame until around 2015, which blew my mind. It's such a famous building. And part of that, according to Remy, when I asked him about it, is because it was never electrified in the attic. And so you could really only see from these small little windows in the gable ends. And the lighting was bad, the access was bad, and nobody had ever undertaken the 2 years of work that they undertook to document those frames. So, systematically, folks had certainly examined the frames, but go ahead. A group that I am part of, Carpenters Without Borders, which is based in France and does kind of hand tool restoration work projects around the world, was very passionate about trying to influence the decision-making around having the cathedral be rebuilt to the medieval style as it had been built. And French forestry, public-private nonprofit also felt very passionate about educating the public about French forests and the presence of ample, beautiful oak trees to rebuild a cathedral like this. So very early on, they teamed up to make a demonstration project. This is in 2020, before anything's been decided officially about how the cathedral would be rebuilt. And they started felling the trees and planning for doing this demonstration project. Go ahead. And in the summer of 2020, in Normandy, about 20, 25 carpenters, just in 8 days, 10 days, a long week basically, came together, starting with logs and only with hand tools, hewed the logs into beams, laid them all out, cut all the joinery, assembled a full-scale principal truss from the nave, and then raised it by hand. I was invited but unable to go because of COVID, and that's still a big regret for me, because in 2021, couldn't fly to France. So they did manage to have members of the architectural team as well as the National Commission that was charged with deciding how the cathedral would be rebuilt. They visited this site, made a very large impression, and helped to influence those decision makers. Go ahead. They were invited to raise the trust a few months later as part of National Architectural Heritage Days and do some demonstration hewing, et cetera, right in downtown Paris in front of the cathedral. That got a lot of media attention and really helped to promulgate this fact actually, that there was the carpenters, the wood, the documentation, the possibility of rebuilding the frame as it had been. And not only rebuilding it, but doing it economically. 20 people in a week doing one of these principal trusses is actually quite amazing. Go ahead. So this is not particularly important, but the Carpenters Without Borders was hired to make a best practices manual for how to procure, store, and work with green timber, because it's not what they're proposing to remake this frame out of green, so not dried oak timbers, is the traditional way that timber framing's pretty much always been done for 1,000 years. But in modern France and in much of the modern world, that's kind of fallen out of favor, or architects and engineers are uncomfortable with traditional methods, et cetera. So as the French government was considering this, they needed some best practice knowledge and manuals for how it might be done. Go ahead. Yes.
You use green lumber then?
Timber, yeah.
What, is that pre-dried or air-dried?
So the question is, if we used green lumber, was it pre-dried or air-dried, et cetera? So just corrected, lumber is technically different than timber. We use timber, which is just thicker. And yes, completely green, so fresh, not dried whatsoever. It was harvested according to the best practices, which is, first of all, in the winter when sap is down, so there's less moisture content in the wood. Second of all, anecdotally and only beginning to be proven scientifically, it's done in the last quarter of the moon, the waning moon. And this is attested historically in all over Europe and other places too. Through hundreds of years, this is attested in trades manuals and commentaries, et cetera. And only now is it just beginning to be studied scientifically a little bit about the moon's influence on fluids, tides, and how that might make a difference in terms of when the wood is harvested. So it was harvested in the best traditional conditions for when the trees would be felled. And they might be some months old, but that means that they're essentially completely wet, not dried at all.
Do you have to account for shrinkage in your dimensions?
Yeah, the question is, did we have to account for shrinkage? And yes, we did. And that was in the planning stage, pre-construction. For the engineers, they were taking sections that were calculated based on the final after shrinkage size and calculating based on those, as opposed to oak generally shrinks based on 1%. And so it's just a ratio that can be fairly easily accounted for. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So in the winter of 2022, the commission did officially decide to rebuild the medieval frames, the choir and nave framing, to the original medieval state, while they decided to rebuild the transept and spire to the Viollet-le-Duc redesign from about 1850. So they essentially decided to rebuild the cathedral to the state it had been just before the fire. My friends and Carpenters Without Borders kind of colleagues who run a small traditional timber framing company in Normandy, decided to submit a bid to try and get the contract, and started contacting me and other folks about our availability. And indeed, they won the contract and began in November of 2022 with going out to the forests, working with foresters to select trees, and started to hew. Go ahead. Just as an aside, every aspect of the restoration of the cathedral has an incredible backstory that's very rich, down to the organ being restored, to the stained glass windows, et cetera. And even every aspect of the carpentry has a wonderful story, including the sourcing of the timber. So the timbers that we were using, 1,200 or so logs, were coming from all over France and were donated from both public and private forests. And that story is told in a few different films, et cetera. This one is a half-an-hour film. Unfortunately, it's in French. But it's a wonderful film that tells the story of folks' involvement with finding these timbers and sending them, and kind of the forestry aspect of what became the frame. Go ahead. So that's the nave again, rebuilding the nave. So the nave looks teeny in this photo. Go ahead. And here it is in plan. So viewed from above, you can see the cross, the central plan. So here we are, bell towers. You'd enter here, the nave where the congregation sits, transept and spire, the choir where it's usually often closed to the public, especially back in historical periods, where it's kind of the sacred / only fancy VIP people get to go up here. The pulpit would have been here. It looks tiny. Again, this is roughly 45 feet wide, 120 feet long, and the trusses were about 35 feet tall. So the volume is massive. It just disappears inside the scale of the entire cathedral. Go ahead. And again, just to kind of zoom in a little bit more, this is a side elevation view of the framing. So here is where the transept starts. You can see the framing changes. That's 1850s era framing. Over here are the bell towers. So we're doing this 120 feet of framing that deals with a lot of longitudinal members, as well as very dense framing of principal and secondary trusses. Go ahead. Yeah,
Can we go back to
sure.
the comment about,
Can we go back to? Yep.
nothing is straight, parallel, level, and plumb?
Yeah, this is the observation is this comment that nothing is straight, level, parallel, or plumb. You can almost see it by eye in this accurate plan sketch of the cathedral that lines aren't particularly straight and exact. And I don't think it was ever built perfect in 1160 to 1200. I mean, we're almost 100 feet off the ground here at the top level of these incredibly ornate walls. And then also the frame and the stone, as well as the frame, underwent various restorations and deformations over 850 years. The decision was made by the planning and architecture team to basically make a replica frame of what had been there, because the level of documentation was so good. So what we were tasked with was creating a frame that fit, first of all, the existing cathedral walls perfectly. They are not straight one or the other. They're actually kind of like in the form of a banana, but not parallel in their banana. In level, they're not straight and level. They both have humps and dips, but not the same. They're scissored to one another in level. And for example, there was about 2 degrees of sweep. It's hard to even explain in words, but there's 2 or 3 degrees of sweep in the frame that we were making. So the ridge of each triangular truss that we were making was in a different location for every single one of the 50 plus trusses we made, for example. And the heights of 0 sitting on top of the walls changed for every single location. There will be more kind of examples and photos of this. So the question is whether all that idiosyncrasy was measured by the grad students. To some extent, no, they were not. They were measuring idiosyncrasies in the framing, like each piece, what its size was, the decorative elements, etc. This information came from both after the fire and before the fire, 3D scanning and other measurements of what the existing conditions of the walls were, because we were sitting this on top of the cathedral walls. So, they were recreating the very top course of stonework on those walls because of heat fire damage, and the decision could have been made to make them level and straight. And they didn't. I'm sure there was a good theoretical reason why they didn't in terms of preservation ethics, but it made for an extremely difficult job for us. I kind of wish that they had made them straight and level, or at least level, if not straight. So again, just drilling down a little bit into the frame that we were working on. This is again in plan here. There's principal trusses. Those are the truss. So to back up, a truss in this context, a roof truss, is a basic triangular element that serves to carry the load of the roof, and it often might help also to stabilize the walls underneath, which is very much the case in this kind of Gothic architecture. Principal trusses are the true load-carrying trusses. They're the ones that take the weight of all the boards and all the lead roofing and whatever, and snow and wind, etc., and transfer that weight and load nice and stiffly down to the walls and eventually down to the foundations, to the ground. So there are principal trusses. In the nave, there was 11 of these trusses. They're spaced every 11 feet if you want. And then in between those are 4 secondary trusses, which really are basically just rafters. They're there to just hold up the roof plane. They're basically there to hold up the roof board so that there's not undulation between the principal trusses, but they're not taking major structural loads. And those are there every 70 to 80 centimeters, which is less than 2 feet apart. So the spacing, 2-ish feet apart. So the spacing of the trusses is extremely dense. And these medieval frames were known as the forest, la forêt, among architects and carpenters for the last century or two, because the feeling one got being in there was a massive density of wood everywhere. And then, we have longitudinal ranks of framing, and central and lateral and sill framing. Go ahead. So here's an example. This is the structural form, the form of principal truss. The 11 of them shared the same structural concept, but every one of them differed from everyone else, not just in small details, such as the section of the timber, the size of the timber might have differed. They even differed to the point that some of them, certain timbers interrupted other timbers, and in the others it would be reversed. So some of these upper cords were interrupted by some of the ties, and in other times these posts were interrupted, et cetera, et cetera. So there's some fairly major differences. And if you remember that the nave frame in particular took 30, 40 years to build, with probably several generations of carpenters working on it, it starts to make a little more sense as to why there would be such difference within one structure.
What does it mean to be interrupted?
Oh, what does it mean to be interrupted? So what I mean is that the framing arrangements between these different 11 trusses changed quite a bit, such that in this one, it's quite hard to see in this level of detail, this post is cut off to allow this beam to pass through uninterrupted. So that's post, and in another, say truss 7, this post was uninterrupted and this upper cord was cut off, and et cetera. So there's quite large differences in the truss forms. Go ahead. And this is just a briefly, these are the secondary trusses. They are not doing much structural work except kind of holding up the roof plane. I mean, they're still very beautiful, but if they was all built of these trusses, the roof would collapse. It would not carry the loads. Go ahead. So fast forward to the first week of January 2023 is when I and the other American carpenters arrived, about a month and a half into the project having started. And we were getting truckloads of incredibly high quality oak logs from all over France. Each of them marked with numbers on there, but that we kept track of throughout the next year of the process, because they were tracked to a GPS coordinate of its exact location in the forest where it was felled. And even if there was multiple logs from the same tree, its position within that tree, such that that data can be used and studied over the coming decades in the behavior of each piece of timber and how forest conditions, forest ecologies, et cetera, might impact timber behavior in place, in situ. Go ahead. Say that again? The question is, where am I working? So we're at a shop in Normandy, about 2 hours drive west of Paris. And all of the carpentry work and pretty much all work that could be done off-site for the restoration of the cathedral, whether it's stone, et cetera, anything that could be done off-site was done off-site, because if anybody's been to Paris, the cathedral's on an island packed in the very heart of the city. There's not much room. There was hundreds of people working there on any given day. It was contaminated with lead, was structurally unsound, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we were working a few hours away in bucolic Normandy. So the first several months of this project with Atelier des Monts, the company of my friends who I worked with, about 20 of us did nothing but hew for several months. So here's a few photos of that. Go ahead. So hand hewing is the process of using axes to create squared rectilinear timbers out of round logs. And go ahead. A fun side story there was a particular design or a few designs of axes that were created just for this project based on research done with contemporary frames in that region, tool marks left behind, sizes, curvature of the bit, etc., and then standards developed by the design team about what could or couldn't be acceptable for our hand hewing to basically try and match what had been done. And so these custom axes were forged by a cooperative group of really great French blacksmiths. Go ahead. Most of those are single bevel rod axes, which means they can only go one way. They're sharpened only on one side. The other side is totally planar, like this one. It's one of those axes. And so this is a right-handed, technically, axe. I could only ever hew this side. I can't hew with it. There were a number of timbers. What we saw sweeping through the shopyard might have been an eighth of the number of timbers that we were preparing. Like I said, there was over 1,000 individual beams. All of them tracked to exactly where they were going to go in the finished frame because the sizes of each member were often not uniform. So these are the tie beams. These are the biggest, longest beams across the bottom of the principal trusses. And each one of them is a bit different. So that's for truss 5, this is for truss 4, that's for truss 2, and all of them have different sections based on the notations from those architectural sketches. Another thing. Oof. So yeah, how long does it take to hew one of these tie beams? It depends who. There's faster hewers and slower. I'm quite a mediocre hewer. Maybe 2 days or something like that. They're about 45 feet long, and in inches you could say roughly, yeah, or maybe a bit longer. We were doing some using chainsaws to score, which is the process of removing a lot of the bulk waste of wood before finish hewing with broad axes, as opposed to the ultra hand tool purest way is to make notches in the log with axes, split off billets to rough rectangular size. And then what you just saw is the finish hewing, the most skilled, hardest part, which is creating the finished smooth surface. So all of that is involved in hewing. It's kind of a moving target for that answer, but. The question about repetitive, I mean, actually some folks were doing this for 6 months. The question about repetitive stress injury, that is, I don't think there were any that I know of, or at least nobody brought them up. We certainly had blisters, and the thing about doing it consistently for that long is that your body really adapts and gets used to it, or at least it did for us. We were conscious of ergonomics. We were conscious of doing warm-ups and stretches in the morning, and most of the carpenters there were already experienced hewers. That's why we were, one of the main reasons why we were on this team. Hand hewing is not a particularly well-known skill in the US or in France, and kind of has been revived in France, mostly thanks to Carpenters Without Borders, this group that's been around for about 25, 30 years, as well as a castle, Guédelon, in Burgundy, that's being rebuilt to medieval standards. Those two groups have been kind of created a revival in hand hewing in France, and the US has acolytes like me and some others too. Anyways, it's a fairly rare skill. Go ahead. A tiny quick detail that you might appreciate, extra complications, that a feature of the Notre Dame original frame that was not unique but of note is that they have something that basically is swells in the timber sections at joinery locations. In French, they're called élégies, or that was the term the architects had used. And it's nice, it creates more area potentially for bearing or more area for the joinery. But what it means in the hewing stage is that you have a log and you need to know where along that log you need to have some extra timber in different dimensions, and be careful while you're doing that to place that extra material in different dimensions. So for example, this is a lateral post in the truss, which we can't quite see, would have been over here. And this one happened to have LEG on these two sides at two joinery locations. And so roughly we added a lot of extra material. And in the end, when it was fully joined, et cetera, there would only be, a quarter of that as a swell that was reduced in a certain way. Go ahead. We also did some pit sawing because that was attested historically in archival photograph for these particular members, which were halved and then are clasping, suspending members. So we did pit sawing as we needed to. A little bit, we'll probably, what time is it? Is that clock down there? Or no, sorry, I've got a clock there. Okay, yeah. All right, so I'm gonna start speeding up a little bit. I don't wanna drag on too long. We're gonna see photos of the actual stages of the joinery work happening now. And I won't dwell too long, but if folks have burning questions, feel free. This is basically in the principal workshop that we had, we could fit half of the nave at once. We couldn't fit the whole 120 feet by 45 feet. And so we staggered the joinery, et cetera. Everything was put together using French plumbline scribe method, which is a method of knowing where the intersections of timbers will be by stacking them physically in place above each other and then using a plumb line and your eye and a pencil to generate what the intersecting joinery is going to be. So that's what you start to see happening here. These two timbers are the sills that rest on top of the stone cathedral walls. There's a flying sill that doesn't rest. You start to see foot notch joinery for the 4 intermediate secondary trusses, a tie beam for a principal truss, 4 secondary trusses, etc. And again, all of this is completely out of level, nonlinear, etc. So we were at each principal truss location, we were adjusting the heights of this base, that's the cap that's sitting on the walls to follow exactly the undulations of the walls. Go ahead. There's some of that stuff that's been scribed down in now. These little brochets, they're the little foot pieces for those principal trusses. They're flipped over right now to fit into those notches you saw last time. Go ahead. There was also another rank of timbers that sits below the tie beams that ties into corbels in the masonry walls. There are these consoles. This is that flying sill that I was talking about that hangs inside of the wall. Go ahead. So that's after they've been scribed and joined together. This is not even half of the length of one side of the nave of these consoles. Go ahead. Again, the French plumbline scribe, piquage à plomb. It's very hard to talk about verbally, and we'd have to do a week-long intensive course to really describe the method. But it's a very simple, technologically a very simple method that really relies on gravity and plumb, and the fact that a string hanging with a weight on it is exactly and perfectly plumb in all 360 degrees everywhere. A spirit level like we use a lot is plumb only in one axis. And so it's about aligning your eye with vectors of intersection. And once you get the hang of it, and having long, sharp pencils, sometimes dividers or other measuring tools to create the joinery of this intersecting into that. That was not a lost technique in France. That's not exactly every shop is using it, but that's relatively still well known in France, as opposed to hand hewing, which is pretty much completely lost in the 20th century. That's just an illustration of somebody busy doing plumbline scribe. Go ahead. So this is an example of a principal truss. My main job for the latter 3.5 months I was there was kind of running the team and the approach of doing the principal trusses, which was an incredible honor. And here we are with the truss kind of laid out and the various timbers stacked up in 3 different layers against each other. So we're about to be setting up to do the scribing for this joint into this joint and this joint into this, so that eventually they end up in one plane. You can see some were already pre-cut and have been joined to have it not be 5 or 6 layers of timbers stacked up. Go ahead.
So if you were managing people to do this, are you fluent in French, and did you know that this has got to be a very specific terminology in French? Some of these words are probably very, very old French. Did you know all of that?
Yeah, the question is if I was managing and I'm fluent in French and knowledgeable of French carpentry, lexicon, etc. The answer is yes, I'm fluent in French, and I had studied and lived and worked in France for 1.5 years in 2009-10. as a timber frame carpenter with a very old trades guild that's been around since, they say, the Temple of Solomon. But at least they're attested in the 11th century. So I had learned a fair amount of these techniques then. Not all of them, but enough. And also doing Carpenters Without Borders projects. Those are typically carried out in both French and English. And I'm often translating, so I'm picking up technical terms and processes all the time.
Did I skip one?
Yeah.
Did I skip one?
Oh, no, I think this is fine. Yeah, so this is just another example of the scribing process. This is half of the central line down the nave. So those posts that are laying here would be the central king posts of the truss. And this is longitudinal framing and wind bracing, all ready, all regulated precisely to scribe the joints. And then go ahead. And then that's what it looks like after it's been scribed and it's test fit. Everything has temporary steel pegs in it as it's getting test fit. You start to see some of the élégie, the swells in various dimensions coming out beneath ones, but they haven't been sculpted and finished yet. Go ahead.
So what would that width be? Longitude?
Go back one. This width, that's half of 120 feet.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, 60 feet or so.
In the assembly, it's not centrally supported.
Right, yeah, that's true. I think, yeah, we were supporting those king posts here and here. I think this was about 30 feet or so, and those are large timbers. So. Right. Yeah, go ahead. These are the lateral, same deal basically, but these shorter lateral walls being scribed right now. Lots and lots of material handling. This is all oak, French oak, or European oak, Quercus robur. Go ahead. Here's again another shot of the principal truss. Go ahead. And more, go ahead. Cutting some joinery. Any surfaces that would be seen, even in installation, even if they were going to get covered up by a roofing later, we did not use power tools to cut. We were able to use chain mortisers, drills, and circular saws for cutting joinery, thankfully, because we had to do this in less than a year. But everything was finished with hand tools, and cuts that were going to be seen on site were done with hand tools like this. Go ahead. Again, this is more just joinery being cut, various mortises, tenons, etc. I'm going to skip some of the details because we're pushing time. An example of shop drawing documentation where we had both some CAD drawings as well as the sketches from those architecture grad students, as well as archival photographs. And then we were also tasked with going through other sources of archival photographs at each location to make sure we got every detail right at each spot. Go ahead. So this was me and my little crew after we did this first. That's truss number 10 actually, was the first one we did. And we were feeling very happy when it had all come together and was fitting good. And it was also exhausting work. Go ahead. More photos of the process. Here I'm sculpting an élégie, one of those joinery swells. Once the joinery's been laid out and cut, I'm getting rid of, kind of rehewing back up to that point, and then that is going to get sculpted in a certain way. There's also all kinds of clasping keys, etc. Go ahead. Here's one of those aiguilles pendant, those clasping pit sawed hanging members that were quite lovely chamfered and sculpted. Go ahead. Yeah, needle, yeah. So there's a finished principal truss. I was up on top of a ladder, but I still couldn't get it into my iPhone's frame. But go ahead. So at one point, we built an extra shed over here to fit another truss in. We even used a neighbor shop at one point, and we had at one point, once all the hewing was done and everything was rolling, we had 5 different truss stations going at once with 20 to 25 of us. Go ahead. It's just showing. Those are secondary trusses, so they just have the rafters and the 3 tie beams or collars. Go ahead. Then we raised these first 2 principal trusses. So part of our job was we needed to dry raise, test fit the entire nave frame before it went to Paris. And that was the same for the spire and the other things as well. There was no time and no room in Paris to be messing around if something wasn't quite working. So we had this enormous temporary, kind of tarp building thing that was there for the year. And we raised the entire nave frame inside of that building. And actually we were still raising one end of it when the first bay started to get disassembled into a stack of timbers and shipped 2 hours to Paris to get assembled there. And we raised the first 2 just with ropes and pulleys kind of as proof of concept to be able to do that. So there's about half of the frame. That's about 60 or 70 feet of the frame being raised there. And you get a sense of the scale. That's my friend Martin, who's about 6'4". So these are big, heavy trusses. Go ahead. Some photos of, you start to get a sense of the density of the timber and why it was called La Forêt, the forest. You can see the elegies have been sculpted to their final form there now, and those forms varied, and we had to try and copy each exact one if there was any evidence, archival evidence that was attested. Go ahead. Lit up at night. Go ahead. This is a 5-minute video. I think I'm going to skip it for now just because it's quite lovely and dramatic music. The French government made it about the carpentry. I was not part of the install in Paris. Obligations with work and family brought me home after 6 months. But I got lots of photos from my colleagues who were there for the 6 months following. Basically, we finished the frame in the middle of 2023, and then roughly over 6 months, every 2 weeks, another 10 feet of the frame, another bay was shipped and installed, while a million other things were happening at once. Go ahead. This is just a shot of the nave frame before our frame started to be installed. This was a temporary glue lamb cap that was put over the top to both keep out water and mostly to stabilize the tops of the masonry walls directly following the fire. The architects were extremely worried directly after the fire that the stabilizing force that the roof framing actually puts on the top of the walls. Without that, they were extremely worried that even in winds, etc., these very fine, very tall, very open with windows, etc., stone walls were going to collapse. So they, within a few weeks, really quite extraordinarily, they placed this cap, and this being dismantled now to raise the permanent nave frame. Go ahead. Just to get a sense of the complexity of the job site. So this is like a job site plan that we could see. So it's got all these various cranes and their radii that you could see that cranes could intersect and hit each other. Two very large, very massive structural cranes, as well as, maybe not shown here, there's 3 or 4 smaller job site cranes. We were working on, I wasn't, but our team was working on one of these raised platforms. You can see a triangle there. That's the shape of one of the roof trusses. It's big enough to pre-assemble and work and fly these trusses up to the top, where they're about 20 feet in the air, so there's still work and storage, et cetera, going on underneath these temporary staging areas. And each of those has its own small crane for manipulating pieces of wood. Go ahead. So kind of a glory shot of one of the principal trusses getting raised high up above the skyline. Go ahead. Here's our install beginning. We started, actually, this is scaffolding where the spire is being built, and here's a truss of the transept, the 1850s, and we're starting from here, going 120 feet towards the bell towers of the entry. Go ahead. So this is showing those consoles that are going down underneath the tie beam level of the trusses. Here's the stone walls, and these babies are going down to bear on stone corbels that were existing in the timber. It's just another shot of a truss in situ. Go ahead. Secondary truss flying in. You can see the nave developing. Obviously, there's all kinds of temporary work platforms, safety equipment, etc. There's a video. You hit the space bar. It shows you very briefly. It's kind of fun to see against the Paris skyline. I can't remember. I knew that in my head a year ago. A few tons. No questions till we're done. All right, keep going. No, I'm happy to talk about that. But so here's a view. This is, all but the last 10 feet are completed. I visited Paris a year ago, last January, actually, right now. And all that was left to do was the last 10 feet or so. It was delayed because of waiting for masons to do some stuff over here. You can see they've totally rebuilt, for example, the tip of this little gable wall. And that's funny. I did this presentation. It says that was before March 8th of last year. Anyways, I've done this presentation several times. It did take place on March 8th. The final bouquet ceremony of the finish of the carpentry phase took place this past March 8th. Go ahead. So almost a year ago. I got lucky when I was there. The staging was still up to the very tip top of the spire. There's this golden rooster that has quite a story to it itself that was there. This is redesigned by the current chief architect to look like a phoenix, symbolizing rising from the ashes. The rooster that had been put up there by Viollet-le-Duc in 1850 had miraculously survived by flying off of the tip of the collapsing spire outside of the burning fire, outside the walls of the cathedral. And inside it were holy relics, a piece of the crown of thorn, a relic of Saint Denis, the patron saint of Paris from the 2nd century, and Saint Geneviève, another patron saint of Paris. Those were all conserved, preserved, and are back inside, as well as a scroll containing names of about 2,000 of the workers who restored. We can just skip right over that. Go ahead. And just a funny photo. So that's the French President Macron. He was given one of these axes, and everybody loves hand hewing now. So go ahead. And to thank my good friends. Go ahead. And my family as well. I still have, thankfully, 2 young kids, but they were even younger then. They were just barely 2 and 3, and they and my wife came over with 6 months to enable me to chase my dream. So I think that's about it. Thank you. This is just for fun, but then the aspect ratio is all screwy. It's one of my buddies doing snow angels in Paris. I just had popped that in there, but we can just close that. Yeah, get out of here. All right. Thank you. Yeah, I do feel proud. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, sure. Yeah, we'll do 15 minutes or so of questions. So I'll just do my best to try and point to folks. So go ahead. The questions about the bells in the bell towers of Notre Dame, what happened to them? Yeah, by chance they had been removed for restoration as part of the ongoing minor restoration that was happening at the time of the fire. So they were all safe and restored, and they were reinstalled in the last year. I don't know the question is how they got them up there. I don't even know exactly the equipment that was used. There is a circle in the stonework in the belfry that you can't figure out why the heck is there a circle in this like kind of stone vaulting ceiling until you realize, oh, they built it in to allow the bells to go up into the belfry tower. In the back, it's about if there was a discussion about hand cut joinery versus CNC joinery. I don't think there was any discussion about that. It would not have fit in the ethos of this project at all to have CNC cut joinery, and I don't think CNC machines can take irregular timbers. They couldn't take timbers that had elegy, those swells. CNC joinery is extremely limiting in terms of the design. So you end up, if you're using CNC to cut a timber frame, you design to what the CNC can do, and doesn't fit in any way, shape, or form with a traditional project like this. You might be able to tell I am not a fan of CNC joinery. I practice hand-cutting joinery myself, and I have the freedom of design. Go ahead. So one question about the advantage of using green timber, because there's some potential disadvantages of the dimensional instability through drying of the green timber. The advantage, well, the one main one is that it's practically impossible. It's impossible in practical terms to dry timber of this size in section. You can air dry it. The rule of thumb is an inch per year or more. So that would be 10, 15, 20 years of air drying. You can kiln dry it. That's quite dicey, especially with hardwoods that are apt to deform a lot more if they're force dried like that. It also changes the cellular structure a bit, tends to collapse cell walls more. And traditionally, timber frame's always been done green. Finally, hewing and working with hand tools is extremely difficult in dry oak, way, way, way easier in green oak. And even the assembly process, et cetera, when the wood is wet, it's a lot more supple. And that actually is to the advantage when you're pulling together a truss, for example. If something is starting to crown, if it was 20 years dry, that bow in the timber would be extremely hard to get out. But if it's restrained by its assembly and dries assembled, it's relatively well restrained, and then things will stay more in plane. And that concept is proved by 1,000 years of empirical experience. Go ahead.
Was it all the same species of oak?
Was it all the same species of oak? Yep, it was all Quercus robur. That is neither. So there's no exact, Quercus robur doesn't grow in North America. That's called in English, common name would be European oak or French oak or sometimes English oak. Robur is from robust, so it basically means strong oak. It's the European oak, building oak, and has been for millennia. The one species that's most, there's several in Europe, but this is the one that's most used for building. It's the closest we have is white oak, Quercus alba, and they're quite similar. Weight-wise, resistance to rot, the fact of the pores being filled in. So yeah, I think the European one is actually a little bit stronger engineering values-wise, and a little heavier, but it's quite similar to white oak if anybody's worked white oak. Go ahead. The question, how do we top this project or what's next? It definitely can't ever top working on this project. There's just no, I think Notre Dame Cathedral is the most visited historical building in the world. So in terms of anything to do with restoration, timber framing, there just is no, it's a once in a millennium project. So extremely fortunate to have taken part. And it looks good on the resume, yeah. So I have just been back at my, very small three or four person operation in Lincoln, cutting fairly small, barns and home frames here since then, which I love doing and which is wonderful, but it's not a cathedral. Right. Yeah. Thank you for that example of the misinformation that was going around after the fire. Yeah, so the first question was personally, how did I get involved in the first place in France and in carpentry in France, I presume? And then the second question is, she remembers reading something questioning whether, there are no more ancient oaks like had been used to build the cathedral. It's not possible to find wood of comparable quality, et cetera. So to answer the second one first, what you read was wrong and patently false. There's no, in the US, we have a real documented degradation of timber quality since only 200-ish years ago. In the East Coast, when there was old growth stands, the type of forest and the conditions in the forest in which a tree grows definitely affect the quality of the timber. But in France, the situation is not analogous, and the wood we were using was actually far superior spec-wise to the wood that had been used for the cathedral originally in terms of clarity, straightness of grain, defects, et cetera. And that's because of liability insurance and engineers basically speccing quality today that was far, far beyond what had been. We could see in documented photos, et cetera, knots, et cetera, that if we had found those knots in the timbers we were using, we would have needed to reject them, for example. So the quality of timber we were using was as good, actually better than the quality that had been used in 1200. So sorry to disprove it. You're looking at me like I'm crazy, but and I got involved in timber framing through my own, I guess, personal finding it as opposed to stick framing, which I started doing in high school growing up in Bristol. And I love the ethics and the craft of it, and then was invited to apply to go and live and learn and work in France from Les Compagnons du Devoir, this ancient trades guild that was reaching out to U.S. Timber Framers Guild, which I was a part of, to make international bridges. So I was selected to do that in 2009. So that was when I went to France first and learned French. And that is not directly connected to this experience. The Compagnons weren't part of this at all, that guild, but it's indirectly related to me becoming part of Carpenters Without Borders, which is a separate organization and which was much more directly implicated in this project. Yeah, that is a great question. The question is, we're amongst us carpenters as we're doing this, were there thoughts and ideas about the processes that might have been done in the 12th century when it was originally being constructed? And yes, we were kind of immersed in the Notre Dame carpentry for months and months. So we were talking about everything from why something, one beam interrupted another, what the structural forms would be, and what the raising processes must have been and why. And what we found is we found a lot of insights through the physical creation at full scale as to why some outstanding historical questions about the frame that some scholars, et cetera, had. We were able to have pretty cool insights into why things might have been done the way they were done, that you don't get some of those insights without physically doing the work and recreating it. Yeah, sure. Yeah, just kind of about the logistics of life, the layout of life. So the company's working 5 days a week. from 36 to 40 hours a week, which is 35 is technically full-time in France, bless the French. But you're allowed to work up to 40 hours a week. So we were working like that with a long lunch break, which is typical for France, frustrating for American carpenters like me that don't want to stop for very long in the middle of the day. And the culture at our company was absolutely wonderful, mostly having to do with the owners of the company being wonderful people and collecting a great group of people around them. We, for example, cooked lunches and ate communally on a rotating basis. 2 carpenters were on cooking and 2 were on cleaning every day of the week. So the company provided basic staples that we would cook with. And so we cooked and ate together at lunch every day at big long tables, lots of respect and soliciting of opinions, et cetera, and a relatively non-hierarchical, basically good folks in a good non-corporate company. The other companies involved, may or may not have been like that, but I was very lucky to be involved in a great culture like that. Because I was there with my family, I rented a house. The other American carpenters basically all shared a rented house that had been kind of set up for them, but I had 2 young kids, so I rented a house and had family and friends come to visit and stay, which was wonderful. Yeah, so a question about tooling, basically. I think I had mentioned before, maybe you heard it or not, that any surface that was going to be visible needed to be at least finished with hand tools. And we were even asked, and we were supposedly not going to use planes at all because planes were not invented in the 12th century, supposedly. We did end up using some planes because, what the heck, nobody's looking over our back, and sometimes it's really just the right tool for the job. And so we were using axes to hew, we were using pit saws to pit saw, and we were using chisels to do finishing work that we needed to do. But any place that it made sense to use a power tool, small handheld power tools, we were using those just to have any chance of hitting our schedule, basically. Hand drilling? No, I don't think we did any demo of hand drilling, like a T-auger or something. And I don't know if in the 12th century augers had been invented yet or not, maybe. But there's lots of archival evidence from medieval times showing people chopping mortises just straight up with chisels. And the French also have extremely cool, really long chisels that you put one end in your armpit and you have a handle called a bisegu that are 1 meter long or more. And so we had some of those on site. It's basically like the French slick, but you can put your whole body weight behind them. And go ahead, yeah, sure. Did we put in sprinklers? We didn't because we were the carpenters, but yes, there is a massively complex state-of-the-art fire suppression system in this. There was fire suppression in the old one, it just didn't work. Obviously it didn't work effectively. There is also heartbreakingly fire stop walls of thick gypsum board and steel frame in between the transepts and the nave and choir and the spire to basically what they've found, theorized, investigating is that the fire was so massive and so fast and unstoppable because the spire acted as a chimney and made an incredible draft shooting up the chimney. And so there's fire stop walls installed now such that you can, visiting the cathedral now, if you get special access to go in the attic, you can see the whole length of the nave, but you can't see from the nave through the transept into the choir and down, which is, really stinks. But maybe last question, how did the fire start? Nobody knows officially. The French government started an inquiry and then just stopped it without giving an answer and without a reason why they stopped it. So I think there was restoration ongoing. It started near the base of the spire and there was scaffolding and restoration ongoing there. So whether a worker threw a cigarette or there was an electrical fire from that work going on, there's no official answer to why it started. I would imagine the government realized what's the point of saying who started it? They're going to be, lynched. It doesn't. At this point, it doesn't matter. So I would guess the government just figured out how it started and then didn't release that publicly. I would guess. All right. Thank you. Thanks very much.